Yo guys, and welcome back to another ZBrush speed sculpting video, and for today we are working on Lilith from Diablo 4. So first things first, before getting into this video, I would just like to state that this is my very first attempt at a humanoid portrait. Technically Lilith is more on the demon side, but she's still a humanoid, got all the human features. This is my first ever attempt at it, and as intimidating as it was from the start, and you shall see that throughout this video, I gotta say I am extremely happy with how this came out, and this is probably currently my favourite sculpt I've done thus far. Now then, so for who is Lilith? Lilith is the daughter of Mephisto and the creator of Sanctuary for the Diablo universe by Blizzard. For anyone who has seen the 2019 Blizzcon announcement video for Diablo, you will know exactly who she is. And I decided to make this sculpt based on that cinematic version of her. I've seen that there's been two versions, the cinematic one where she first comes into form, and therefore is very translucent, very red, just overall very, very creepy looking. And there is her more fleshed out version, a more complete version, which I suspect we'll see in the game. Haven't seen the actual in-game model yet, but we've seen some concept art, and it looks fantastic, but I wanted to go with the really creepy red version because I figured that cinematic was so incredibly amazing. I have a feeling it's going to be quite iconic, especially seeing her come into being for the first time. Now then, enough of the backstory. As for the sculpt, so as you can see here, at this current stage in the sculpt, like I said, I've never done a human portrait before, and I do spend the sheer majority of the sculpt nitpicking, trial and error, trying to fix areas, because again, as you can see right now, it was terrifying at the beginning. I really had no idea, no technique, no, well, plan in general as to how to approach this. I just did as I always do and dived right in. The majority of the time when it comes to me trying out new things in ZBrush, I don't really have any idea, you know, in advance. I really just dive in and just hope for the best. Which, it works for me. It's not necessarily a technique that would work for most people, but it works out quite nicely for me. Just keep on going until I get something that I like, and then keep on adapting and working with it. And that's pretty much the way I had to approach the entirety of this. For the longest time, the face was just utterly hideous, but I just had to believe that I'd eventually get through it, and eventually I did. It did take quite a bit of time, like so, trial and error. One of the biggest issues I had from the beginning of this is the general proportions of the face, especially segments like the forehead, the temple, so and so, because Lilith has these really insanely giant horns, like an absolutely massive cluster of horns going on. And that was going to take up a lot of the proportions of the head, especially with the forehead, which, while live streaming this, I was very reasonably criticised that the forehead was a bit too big or too small. Thus I opted to add in the horns relatively early, but only the most basic form using the Z-spheres or Z-spheres. That way, again, the proportions are there, the layout or the silhouette, so and so, and I could then use that as a measurement to try and proposition or compose everything else. And it worked out quite nicely in the end. It did take quite a while before I actually worked on the horns themselves, because, like I said, my absolute focus was making the face not as creepy as possible. Granted, Lilith herself is a very creepy figure. That's more due to her colour scheme and the fact that you can see her skeleton and organs through her skin than it is due to the actual features on her face. As far as her facial features go, she's very normal. She just looks like a very scary lady, a very, very like, strong and imposing woman. But again, it's the translucent skin that really gives it like the creepy edge, and of course the great big horns. So skipping onwards throughout the recording, I'd say the sculpt, in terms of recording, the sculpt took about 6 hours. I feel like it may have taken more about 7 hours in total. But skipping ahead, once again, really trying to focus more on the face and trying to get like all the structure in place, trying to like make it less creepy, more like actually Lilith herself. One thing I did notice actually was that the eyes, or the eyeballs, were too big. And that is a major issue I tend to have on my sculpt in general, is I accidentally make the eyeball too large, and therefore I'm compensating too much with the eyelids, the eye socket, etc, and just adding just too much, when in reality it's the eyeball itself that is the issue. Fortunately, I was able to catch this in this model and was able to fix it accordingly. which really made a huge difference to the overall composition of her face. On that note though, her eyes in the cinematic are very slanted, they're quite diagonal, and that was a really tricky thing to deal with here, because while human eyes aren't necessarily incredibly horizontal, they are fairly flat, fairly straight, whereas her, at least in the perspective that we see her within the cinematic, again, hers very diagonal, and so that was really tricky to try and work out here. Not only that, but eyes are also one of my weaknesses. As much as I love colouring and texturing the eyeballs, the irises, pupils, etc., when it comes to the actual shape of the eye socket, all the little subtle details like the upper eyelid, the lower eyelid, the crevice between the eyelid and the eyebrow, the tear duct, all of these things I really struggle with, and as I said, the majority of this sculpt was spent nitpicking and trial and erroring, going back and, repetition, until I eventually got to something I liked. Now, I was very fortunate with this because, as I said, I was live streaming it, and one user did mention about how the biggest flaw or hiccup a lot of people encounter with eyes is the tear duct, where the tear duct is either like non-existent or is overcompensated, exaggerated. And thanks to him mentioning that, it made me pay a little bit more attention to what I was doing. And so I was able to eventually get a more subtle form for the tear duct, which again, kind of made everything else proportionally better. It's really interesting how throughout this model, all the simple little features, all the subtleties here and there, and how they really play off each other, and just how one strangeness in one smaller area that you wouldn't really think matters can make the entire thing just look off. And it is so hard to find it as well. But like I said though, it really was a great learning opportunity. So progressing onwards more, I eventually reached a point where, when it came to the face, I kind of felt like I was obsessing over it too much. Now, of course, I wanted to be right, but it is so difficult, at least for me, my lack of experience. I was having such a hard time. I eventually conceded and thought, alright, let's step away from the face for a moment, let's step away from the little features and focus on the horns a little bit more. Now, one thing that's very interesting about Lilith's horns is that they are all one large thing. Normally, whenever I make my horns, I tend to make them out of lots of different separate subtools, which are different layers in ZBrush. And that makes it a lot easier to kind of like detail each individual one, especially the overlapping areas. But with Lilith, her skull or her horns are just one great big structure. So it meant that a lot of the ridges tend to kind of merge together per horn. And it was overall just really unique and really interesting. And kind of like, in a way, it was quite freeing, not having to worry about the different layers and worrying about overlapping because they really were connected. It was quite freeing in a way, liberating. But it was also a bit of a struggle on its own. Another perk to working on the horns now meant that I can also combine the horns into the head subtool itself, because once again, I normally had the horns and the main body at different subtools, but once again, in the cinematic, her skull, her forehead and her horns are very distinctly attached, to the point where the texture kind of transitions as opposed to an abrupt, start and end. So once again, had to merge those together, which again made it very easy and much more, what's the word? It gave me a much easier time, a much easier approach towards combining it all, and again, composition, all that kind of stuff. Now for the horns themselves. The horns are ridged like crazy. They have so much detail going on, and I've never done anything like this before. I had a vague idea as to how I'd approach it, and that was to use some sort of alpha. In the end, I used an arrow alpha. Kind of surprising, but it really worked out in the end. Defined each of the heights, or like the higher ridges, and thankfully again during the live stream, Rag, the absolute legend, informed me that ZBrush supports a stabilizer for the mouse, or for the cursor, for the pen, and that made drawing the ridges so much easier, so again, thank you Rag. So that's how I was able to get the smooth lines in the ridges in the end. So I added, like I said, I added the higher ridges, then I embedded into it, I dug out some lower ridges, made it really exaggerated, because in the end, that is how our horns are, they're very exaggerated. And while doing all of this, while adding all the ridges, all the various details and so, I kept the technique in mind that later on what I'll do is I'll use colours to really exaggerate a lot of the depth. Because as you can see in the cinematic, the tips of the ridges, the higher parts, are all like a very pale, kind of like pinkish, reddish, whitish hue. Whereas the deeper parts of the ridges are very, very dark, very exaggerated. And I was going to do that exact same thing here, which would then mean, or would then offer me a false sense of depth, and would overall really complement the entire design and really help me out. It was a lot of fun though doing these horns, because it was such a massively exaggerated thing. Like, everything I had to do was so over the top, and it was really quite interesting. What was also quite interesting is drawing the little crossing ridges, the vertical ones that kind of wrapped around the entirety of the horn. Those were also very random in the end. Not quite random, but one thing I've been teaching myself about realism is that realism is full of imperfections. It's full of blemishes and impurities, and the worst thing that you want is to have things neat and perfect. So throughout doing the ridges, it may have looked like I was rushing, I may have looked very, very sloppy. To be fair, I probably was. Again, maybe more so, I am still learning. But I felt like I did a really good job of creating like a more believable structure. Because once again, nature is not perfect. And it, for another point, it actually made the horns very easy to do as well, because one thing that I'm also trying to teach myself is that on top of nature not being perfect, is also that I'm kind of encouraging myself to rush things a little bit more, because as great as it is having a masterpiece, at the end of the day, I need to do these masterpieces in a reasonable amount of time. Not that I consider it a masterpiece, but you get the point that I'm saying here. I'm trying to train myself to do things quickly and to find efficient techniques, which again I think I really found on this horn style here. That way I can replicate it again in the future and it won't take some ridiculous amount of time. I think in the end, the majority of the horn structure, like actually building up and detailing it and such, well, not detailing it, but you know, making a structure, I think that alone took an hour. Which, for the complexity of the horns, personally, I'm extremely satisfied with. Maybe it's too fast, not really sure, but at the end of the day, as long as it has the finish I'm happy with, I personally think it's okay. I think it's okay to be a bit too quick. Now, skipping ahead further on and having all that fun with the horns, I then finally had to increase the resolution a little bit more. I've been very afraid of increasing the resolution in the sculpt because it's a human, and the thing with human sculpts is they are so easy to make look creepy and uncanny, so I had to really make sure that from the lower resolutions I was happy with it, but I kept on reaching a point where I couldn't do certain details, such as the lips, the nostrils. I couldn't do the ears properly or the very fine bits around the eyes because once again it was too low resolution. So in the end I had to bump it up, and I was able to focus on areas a little bit more. I was also able to create the transition from the horns into the skin, which I was very happy with. Next up I had to do the what we absolutely named the flesh cloak or flesh cape, which is a... You'd have to watch the cinematic to truly understand it, but in short, it is a cloak of flesh or a cloak of skin. It is quite gruesome. Very, very cool though. And I had to try and do that because if I'm gonna draw Lilith as she just emerged, it only makes sense I add like every little gruesome detail as well, such as what you see in the model, this big sheet of skin coming out from her neck. It sounds very strange to say out loud. Now for this part here was quite interesting because this is a good reminder to try and block out parts. One mistake, or one thing I don't do enough of in ZBrush, is actually using large basic primitives like rectangles, blocks, etc. to create like a very vague mass of my shape that I'm coming up with. I remember to do that with this little flesh cloak here, and it worked out quite nicely. Once again, I'm trying to learn to do things efficiently and quickly, and I felt like that really nailed it here. And then after that, starting to mask off little areas and pull them upwards, that way I can create like little sheets of skin that kind of like drape over it all. I have to emphasize, it sounds very strange saying it all out loud, so I apologize if I'm skipping my words a little bit, but calling things like flesh cloak is just really strange. And as well as doing all of that, I also tried to emphasize the neck and the upper part of the torso a little bit more. One thing I'm lacking a lot in my portrait busts, like such as dragons and such, is I feel like I cut off the neck too early. So I'm trying to get into the habit of at least adding the collarbone in. And I feel like that for Lilith here, it was really a perfect choice because you get to see everything, or at least all the important detail without her head feeling too detached. So, once all of that was done, once I finished the neck, the collarbones, the flesh cloak a little bit more, I then began focusing more and more on the face, and it's around this stage that I started feeling more familiar with the face. I started to feel or resemble more like Lilith than it did earlier. Getting more and more satisfied with it, more confident with it. And it was around this stage I decided that I actually started adding some imperfections, started adding like an odd couple of wrinkles and creases, making her eyes look very tight with the bags underneath, because again, they're very exaggerated in the cinematics. I had to exaggerate them here as well. Also fixing up a few of the other areas, such as the top of her skull where her horn's gonna split off. She's got like this very ugly tear in her skin. In fact, she has like a lot of tearing in her skin all around her horns. It truly looks like her horns have burst open from her skull and torn the skin apart. That, I have to admit, I did not really do very well here, because to be entirely honest, I didn't really know how to. That's not a very good reason for it, but considering how this is just like more of a hobbyist fan art kind of thing, I was willing to give myself a couple of liberties here and there. But I have to admit, when it came to the flakes of skin where her horns are, I kind of really should have put a little bit more effort into it in the final product. However, I do think they do a good enough job of translating what they, what they actually are. But I still think I could have done it a little bit better. And then eventually we got to my two favourite parts, and that was one, adding the texture, or more like the bumps and skin texture and all that kind of stuff onto the sculpt, and after that was the texturing. One little minor dilemma I actually had with this model was that in the cinematic, Lilith's skin is extraordinarily smooth. She was just, just newly created or newly formed, and her skin is incredibly smooth. In certain areas like the horns, the forehead, etc., those areas were of course very cracked, very rough. But in areas, especially around her neck and her cheeks, like I said, very, very smooth. So what I originally opted to do for this model was to leave those areas completely plain. No blemishes, no marks, nothing. And I kind of realised much, much later on, while adding the colours and everything, adding the new material, that it just looked really plastic. Or it just looked like extremely artificial, so I eventually had to opt in to add some blemishes after all. Just like a very, very subtle skin texture. And in the end, that really minor subtlety, as we'll see in the final of the model, really helped bring it together. It just really helped add that little bit of realism. So that was a bit of a lesson to myself. Even for the absolute smoothest natural texture I can create, it still needs a blemish, otherwise it would just simply look fake. Speaking of looking fake, one of the biggest issues I had throughout all this was the lips. I don't know what it is, but the lips were just the biggest hurdle I had throughout all of this. Even in the finished product, I'm still not completely satisfied with them, but it just got to a point where I really couldn't figure out what it was. Since, once again, in the cinematic, her lips are very dark, they're very emphasised. They're quite large, and fair bit of detail, but I found that whenever in this sculpt I tried to, make them darker, it just looked like lipstick, or it just looked really strange. And I especially tried colouring around the lips as well, like around the cheeks, the jawbone, the chin, everywhere, not just the lips themselves. That way any colours I added in felt more like not secluded to the one area. But again, it never mattered, it just always felt weird no matter what I did. I think in the end, I may have actually settled on too low a resolution, since another habit I'm trying to remove from myself is going into these really insanely high resolutions. You'll find that at the end of this model I'm at about 4 million polygons, whereas what I have been doing my last couple of sculpts in the past is reaching up until 30 million. And while for a conceptual piece, something that's purely meant to look pretty, that's not necessarily a bad thing, I do want to get into the habit of figuring out how to make things look good on a low resolution, that way I can then translate it better into an actual riggable model. Since you can't rig a model of 1 million polygons, I'm pretty sure it doesn't work. So, all of that aside, once I got to a point where I was really satisfied with the the general form of the model, it was time to move on to the textures, my absolute favourite part. And as I always do my textures, I started with a rather light, like just an overall light colour scheme for the entire thing. In this case, a bit of a light fleshy pink, and then added in a lot of low lights and shadows all over the place. I have to admit, it kind of makes it look like she's got a bit of a stubble going on, a bit of a 5 o'clock shadow. Unfortunately, that is how it is in the cinematic, so I kind of had to just deal with it. But it was kind of distracting. The horns, I have to admit, were really... They're a ton of fun to texture. They're also an absolute nightmare, just like they were to sculpt as well, because the horns just had so much going on. They were very new, very different, but I meant for a lot of experimenting and a lot of learning. So, overall, the biggest thing with this model, the absolute biggest hurdle that I had to consider from the very, very beginning before even starting. And that is that in the cinematic, Lilith has a translucent skin. You can see through her skin, you can see her organs, her veins, her beating heart, her bones. That's something I cannot do in ZBrush. At least to my knowledge. I have seen that ZBrush supports some form of translucency, but believe me when I say it would not have worked in the scenario, it just would not have worked at all. So from the very, very beginning of conceptualizing this model, I always knew I was going to do this with texturing. I was going to somehow try and get a fleshy appearance, a translucent appearance via the textures. And that again was a lot of trial and error. It was especially difficult because Lilith has a very grand contrast of shades in her skin. Some areas are like a very, very bright, vivid red, like extremely red. And other areas like a very, very dark, kind of like nasty red-brown. And whenever I added like these bright red textures onto my model, that just felt very, very weird. It just felt extremely off-putting, distracting. So, once again, it was a sheer case of trial and error. Keep on constantly doing more and more and hoping I get to a point that I liked, and eventually I did. But I have to be honest, I don't really know how exactly I managed it. I do believe that in the end it was just a combination of overlapping so many varying shades and alphas and eventually just coming to a point that I liked. The biggest thing in particular with this was that I couldn't really have any colorations that were just like a simple circle or simple like a blurred sphere. I couldn't just have a zone be the one colour. It had to be multiple shades of multiple alphas and multiple silhouettes and just so many things overlapping and so many things happening all at the same time. That's where I felt like I kind of managed to obtain those textures. But like I said, I wouldn't be able to actually say for sure how I did it. I'd say that when it came to the texture scheme, one of the hardest things I had to deal with was the throat, actually. In the cinematic, you can actually see her vertebrae through her throat. It is nasty and so cool. Now, that was a thing that would have been very, very hard because especially, well, you think, right, the vertebrae is at the back of the neck, whereas this is a front viewing portrait, so I had to do it from the front. So in essence, the way I had to draw, do a silhouette, if you will, of the vertebrae in this model, was actually doing it in her throat, like the front of her throat. So it looked really, really strange looking at it from different perspectives. It was also really jarring because the way I had to introduce that was to have like a large red brush just going down the entirety of her neck and then blocking it all out. And for a very, very long time, it just looked utterly bizarre. But, like I said, by adding layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of different shades and alphas, I eventually managed to make something that, in my opinion, actually looked pretty decent. You could see what it was meant to be. It didn't look too cartoonish or too blocky. I think it actually came out looking quite alright, and I was very surprised because I really had no idea what I was doing. I think that kind of summarises everything about this model, really. I don't really have much idea what I was doing. The only thing I planned ahead of time was that the textures were going to do a lot of the work. The textures were going to do all the translucency of the skin. They were going to portray all the depth in the horns. And that was about it, really. Other than that, it was just blindly making marks and hoping that eventually I would come across something that I actually liked or resembled the model. So, eventually, upon lots and lots of texturing, like I said, I did spend quite a bit of time on this. I'm so happy that it came out. I did eventually run this through with my other half, Kev, and because Kev has an incredible eye for detail, and especially if it's a character he recognises, and he loves Lilith. So he was able to help point out a couple of flaws in this model. Some of the flaws including that the largest of the two horns were a little bit too far backwards. I had to kind of like make them curve forward a little bit more. The nose was a little bit too large or too wide. The lips were like too angular, too angry looking. But, oh, and the neck was a little bit too wide as well. So thanks to him, I was able to finish off a couple of like the final pieces, post-texturing. And eventually, we just came up to a point that I was really satisfied with. In fact, before we get to the end, looking at the horns right now, when it came to colouring the ridges of the horns, that was so conflicting. You can see right now, as I sketch in all the little whiter outlines into the ridges, it looks really sloppy. It looks really cartoonish. It looks strange. And it kind of like breaks away from like that more natural look we had earlier. And I really didn't like it as I was going through this. I really did not like the technique I was using. I did not like how it was coming out. But I insisted upon myself to keep going because I really didn't know how else to do this. Like I said earlier, her ridges are very exaggerated and high contrast in terms of colour schemes. The ridges are very light, whereas the pits are very dark. And how can I make the ridges light without making them light? Now, fortunately, after doing all of that, I was then able to eventually add in the lowlights once again, and quite simply, using the colour spray setting on the tool, I was able to just like kind of get like a random colour scheme of things going on, just noise, general coloured noise over a lot of the ridges. And it really helped offset them. It helped make them, you know, blend in a little bit better, look a bit more natural. It still has, like, you know, the ridges are still there and visible, which I wanted. I wanted it to be like a definitive outline for each individual ridge. But fortunately, it doesn't look quite as ghastly as it did before. And now we start working on the throat, like I mentioned earlier, the whole vertebrae thing. In fact, here you can see how I begin it and how it looks really blocky and just really, really silly. It just looks very, very off. But as you can see, kind of like adding in all sorts of lowlights, all sorts of different shading. One very, very valuable lesson I learned from all of this is that while Lilith herself is a very red character, very red, very pink, all those lighter colour schemes, adding purple and blue really helped offset so many textures. I used like a fair bit of purple and blue around the lips, around the mouth, around the eyes, and eventually around the throat. And there's something about it, like the cooler texture, just, I really just don't know, to be honest. It's a thing that I know is the case, like in general when it comes to colouring, just thing. I can't describe it, as you can tell. Just trust me when I say, adding the blue and purple really helped, and it really made it look more alive and just less red, which is kind of funny. By adding the blue and the purple, it made the red feel more red. It was weird. The eyes, I absolutely loved doing the eyes. They were actually very, very simple. When I made the eyes pure black, as you can see now, as horrifying as it looked, God, I just loved how they contrasted with the eyelids. As I mentioned much earlier in this video, eyelids are a thing that I really struggle with in general, and I'm just so happy that it came out here. The texture, the shape, the form, everything. And the iris, as always, I had a lot of fun painting in. I do love texture in the eyes, and I had a lot of fun with here as well. And then, eventually, here we are with the final sculpt itself. First of all, I apologise it's taking so long to talk over. I honestly thought it'd be a lot smaller than this, but the more I saw, the more I wanted to point out. But here is the finished sculpt herself. Like I said at the very beginning, I have never done a humanoid portrait. Absolutely never. In fact, I don't think I've drawn a human, like even in 2D, for several years now actually. So this is my first human in general. And I am so happy. The material may look a little bit bright. I end up using a sketch shaded 3, and what you're seeing here is with all the various lighting and rendering etc as well. It's unrendered, but you can see all the different settings, and I chose that because it's the most alike the cinematic, but also because when I used like the generic lighting, it made the skin really dark and cartoonishly red. Whereas what you see here now with all the different blues and purples and the right half being really bright, the left half being really dark, there's so much contrast, it's really bright, but when it renders, it looks, in my opinion, fantastic. Still, kind of high contrast, very bright, but it looks better than a lot of the other things I was originally coming across. Now, like I said, I did mention earlier this isn't perfect, and a couple of things that aren't perfect are, as much as I like the eyes, they do still feel a little bit off. I think it might be the angle, I'm not sure. I've never really been very good when it comes to, like, this whole segment over here around the temple. I've never been very good at doing that, but I couldn't really figure out how to change it either. I didn't have very many perspectives or references of Lilith, only really the one angle like this, and then concept art, which is very different. I had to like kind of piece it all together and, you know, tie it in myself, fill in the blanks. But I'd say quite happy with it though. The lips, like I said, there's just something very off about the lips. I think it's a lack of detail. I think the resolution may be a bit too low. I'm not really sure how else to deal with that. But as like I mentioned earlier, the lips are distinctly dark, and I had to kind of darken the entire area around it to try and make it look not quite so comical. I also had to darken a segment of her forehead up here. That was more due to the rendering actually. I had to exaggerate the darkened area up here. I think it worked out quite nicely. And as you can see here, as I mentioned about the vertebrae in the neck, it is extremely subtle now, and when I move it around, it looks kind of strange. But then when you're looking at it just from head on or just from one angle, if you kind of lose yourself into it, it does look like the actual vertebrae themselves. And again, just really happy that it came out. And thus at last we come across the rendered version with all the lighting, all the shadows, and so on. Now unfortunately, this is not the final render. I'm gonna have to spend quite a bit of time doing that because like I said, I'm so proud of this model, I'm so happy with how it came out. That final render is going to require a bit of nitpicking, and I'm afraid it will not be in this video. I am sorry about that, but you can find it in the description and in comments, social media, etc, etc. I will link it all for you. You just can't see it right now in the video. Now, you're probably thinking that this render looks extremely high contrast. Again, it will look better later on, but saying that, I actually kind of like the high contrast. I spent so long trying to make it look exactly like the cinematic in terms of lighting, as well as, you know, color scheme, etc. I actually really like the dark background. I think it just does such a good job of highlighting her. And at the end of the day, it is fan art. I'm not creating a exact perfect replica. I'm making my own piece here, so I actually quite like the high contrast. I'll try to dial it back a bit in the final images or the final, you know, renders and such. But for here, I'm happy with it. I really am happy. I feel like it really emphasised a lot of things, and in particular, there's a distinct difference between left and right. That is an issue I have with my models, is where I'm very lazy with the lighting, and it looks very generic and very bland. Here, you can see that the left horn is a different colour to the right horn. The left side of her face is a lot brighter than the right side. That's something I really like, and I'm going to try and emphasise in the final render. Like I said, you'll see all of that in the video description down below. But, my friends, I think I've been rambling long enough. This video's come out so much longer than I intended. But, as I said, I had a lot to say, a lot to share, and a lot to explain. If you'd like an even deeper explanation on how I managed to do certain things, I would recommend watching the live stream of this. I will post that in the comments as well when it is up and available, as I do try to explain a lot of my process as I'm doing it, because like I mentioned, I didn't really know what I was doing, so I really tried to voice my thoughts, and like I said, hopefully it just gives you like a much deeper insight. But otherwise, guys, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you've enjoyed it, and hey, I hope a lot of you are looking forward to Diablo 4 as much as I am. I am incredibly hyped, as you can tell, and I really look forward to playing that when it comes out. As always, thank you so much, and I will catch you all next time. Cheers.